and welcome to the Your Parenting Mojo podcast. We have a really fun topic to dive into today because I'm going to share some valuable parenting lessons from the world of dog training. I've decided we've been a bit too focused on children's needs here on the show for a while, so we're going to forget about all that respectful and gentle parenting crap, and we're going to go gung-ho into rewards and punishments. We're going to learn how to effectively we can shape behavior by giving food treats for good performance on a task, ignoring behavior we don't want to see, and using little clickers to tell our children exactly when they've met our expectations for good behavior. You're going to leave this episode with some incredibly useful tools. Well, that last part is true. Perhaps you might suspect the rest is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's true. We are going to learn some lessons from the world of dog training today, but they might not be what you'd expect. Before we get into that, I hope you're enjoying the content that I share here on the Your Parenting Mojo podcast, whether it's understanding the intricacies of academic research, breaking down difficult concepts into actionable ideas, or giving you those light bulb aha moments that make parenting just a little bit easier. I want to take a moment to give a huge shout out to some incredible parents who make this work possible. Elizabeth M., Brittany W., Kristen B., Carrie R., Abby C., Nicole B., Grace S., Emma L., Samantha G., Flora H., and Jessica S. Your financial help has been a vital part of this journey. And I know that many more parents share the podcast with others, offer feedback, and cheer me on. Your contributions are all deeply appreciated. You're helping Your Parenting Mojo to thrive, and I'm so grateful for you. I do have a quick question for you. I'm wondering, have you ever been listening to an episode and thought, wow, I didn't know that, or this is exactly what I needed to hear today? If you nodded, even just a little, it means that Your Parenting Mojo is making a difference in your life. Here's the thing though, creating this podcast isn't free. Between the time I spend researching, writing, and recording, as well as the hard costs of editing, publishing, and hosting, it all adds up. And while I absolutely love doing this, I can't do it without your support. I know how busy you are and how many things are competing for your time, energy, and money. That said, if this podcast has helped you to navigate those messy, beautiful, and challenging parenting moments, I'd love for you to join Elizabeth, Brittany, and everyone else as supporters. Think about it like this. When you find a book that you love, you may often buy it. When you stream your favorite show, you pay for the subscription. With many of these services, you don't have a choice. You can't access it unless you pay. When you hear public radio fundraising drives, it's easy to assume that someone else is going to pick up the tab. Right now, 12 listeners are helping with this, so your contribution, whether it's the cost of a cup of coffee a month or a bit more, makes a real measurable difference in my ability to bring you thoughtful, well-researched content that helps you parent with confidence. So if you've been meaning to support the show, now's a great time. It's quick, it's easy, and I know from when I do the exact same thing for the resources I use, it feels good to spend money on something that's meaningful to us. You can head to yourparentingmojo.com/support to make a one-time or ongoing contribution. I appreciate every single one of you, whether you're donating, sharing the podcast with friends, or my book, simply tuning into new episodes. You're why I do this. I'm so grateful to be on this journey with you. Thanks for listening, thanks for being here, and thanks for allowing me to support you on this bit of your parenting journey. And now, let's talk about the dog training, because I'm actually serious about that. This episode came about in a way that I was not expecting at all. Karis and I have started volunteering at our local animal shelter, the East Bay Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, because she loved animals so much. We applied as soon as she turned 10, which is their age cutoff, and we drive 45 minutes each way because so many other shelters have much higher age cutoffs. The shelter counts me as the lead volunteer and Karis as my helper, but we think of it as the other way around. Karis runs the show and I do what she asks. Before we started volunteering, the shelter had us watch some orientation videos, which Karis was watching as I was sitting next to her. And you can only imagine how shocked I was to hear that the shelter uses a consent-based framework when interacting with dogs and cats. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know that such a thing existed. I grew up with animals. My stepmother had around 25 dogs, not including puppies at any one time, and cats and cows and pigs, sheep, over 20 breeds of chickens, chinchillas, barn owls, you name it, we had it. We weren't mean to the animals, and especially the dogs, but we had a lot of not very well behaved dogs because she didn't have time to train them all. And we absolutely did things like yanking on their leashes to pull them away from things they weren't supposed to get into, which now I know isn't great practice. I had a cat for about 16 years, and I think overall it's easier to use a consent-based framework with a cat because they kind of do whatever the heck they want, but I'd never specifically thought of it in that way. So you can imagine how my antenna went up as soon as I heard this idea of consent-based work with animals, and I paid much closer attention to the training after that. I also talked with some of the behavior specialists at the shelter who pointed me toward a number of excellent resources. I want to especially call out Micah McKechnie, behavior and training specialist at the East Bay SPCA, and also Tressa Fessenden-McKenzie, formerly of the East Bay SPCA, now Director of Operations and Programs at the Humane Society of Sonoma County. Both of them helpfully answered my questions and directed me on to further resources. I also read a really great book called The Other End of the Leash, Why We Do What We Do Around Dogs by Dr. Patricia McConnell, which provided many of the stories we're going to hear about today to illustrate the connections between the ways we treat our children and the ways we treat dogs. So to be clear, I'm not saying we should train our children to do tricks or even come with the moment when we call them. But there were some really important ideas in the dog training resources that are remarkably similar to ideas you may have heard before on the show. And I thought that hearing them in this context might help them to stick for you if they haven't already. So we're going to go in reverse order. Dog training hack number 10 is the one that sparked my interest in this topic, which is the idea of creating a culture of consent. In dog training, consent means the dog has real choice on whether or not to engage with you. If the dog doesn't want to play, we won't play right now. It also means interacting with the dog in the way that they want to do it. So when Karis and I did the initial volunteer training, we learned about what the trainers call consent checks, which is where you approach an animal in a way that's likely to minimize their distress. So with dogs, we're basically doing the opposite from what we do with humans. Imagine two people who are meeting each other for the first time. They're facing each other, they're making eye contact, they're shaking hands. Dogs don't meet each other like this, and they don't like meeting us like this either. They much prefer if you approach it from the side with your face turned partially away from them, and if you don't make a lot of direct eye contact. We might pat our thighs to encourage them to come closer, especially if you think a dog might be feeling afraid, rather than directly extending a hand to them, which they might bite if they're not feeling good about the contact. Assuming you feel safe enough to proceed because the dog isn't giving you any back-off signals, then you pet them gently for a few seconds, and you stop and you see what they do. If they turn their head or their body away from you, that's a signal they didn't like what you did and or they don't want to do it anymore. If they do things like coming towards you, nuzzling your hand or your body, putting a paw on you, you know that they're asking for more of what you were just doing. They've consented to the encounter and they're requesting more. This is a primary rule of consent. It has to be okay to say, no, I don't want to engage right now, and to do that without fear of retribution. We aren't going to say, well, fine, I'm not taking you for a walk today then because you don't want to play with me right now. Because when a person says no to us, they aren't rejecting us. They're just saying, your request doesn't help me meet my need right now. Tressa Fessenden-McKenzie told me that many trainers nowadays will make a toy available that the dog really likes, like a snuffle mat, which you can imagine as kind of a square of shag pile carpet that you can hide treats in, that the dog finds both interesting and relaxing, because dogs do find sniffling to be relaxing. The dog gets to choose whether they engage with whatever the trainer has planned or the snuffle mat. So if they choose to work with the trainer, then we know it's a real choice. I guess the key here is that the dog is also going to find the training fun, because I can imagine that if you offered your child it could engage with a fun toy or come with you to brush their teeth, they might well choose the fun toy. But if they're resisting toothbrushing, we're going to want to work as hard as we can to try to understand why the child is resisting toothbrushing, what needs they have, like fun and play and comfort, that they might be leading them to resist toothbrushing when those needs aren't met. Then they're going to be more likely to be willing to brush teeth, even if it isn't quite as exciting as their equivalent of a snuffle mat. We can also make sure that we have both verbal and non-verbal consent when we're asking a child to do something. So if we ask our child to do something and they say yes or okay, but you know that they don't really want to do it, you don't really have their consent. So let's imagine that you've asked your child to set the table one day and they say no. And the next day you ask them and they say okay or fine in a voice that you know doesn't really mean that. And they stomp down the hallway to the kitchen and they crash around in the cutlery drawer, which they then shut with a bang, and they slam the cutlery down on the table, and it might seem like we're making progress. The child's setting the table, after all, which is what we wanted them to do. Surely, if they're doing the task now, even though they seem unwilling, and if they were refusing to do the task at all yesterday, then we must be progressing along the path toward the child doing the task willingly. But is this really progress? I'm wondering if you remember a time when a similar interaction happened with your own parents, when they forced you to do something you didn't want to do. Did you become more willing to do that task over time? Or every time you did the task, did it remind you of how much you hated that they forced you to do it, and maybe even hated them for making you do it? We wanted our need for autonomy to be met, just like our children do now. And the fact that we did the task didn't mean that we would be more willing to do it in the future. If we did do the task next time, it just meant that we'd given up on trying to ask for help in getting our needs met. We'd accepted that our parents would never truly understand us, and we resolved to hide things from them that were special and important to us. Yes, the task was getting done, but was this progress where it really counted? I would argue that no, it wasn't. And this leads us into hack number 9, which is that we shouldn't try to dominate our dogs or our children. Many dog trainers who follow outdated advice advocate for making sure the dog knows who's boss. Dr. McConnell, the author of The Other End of the Leash, recounts a story of the new owners of a golden retriever puppy, Scooter, who was stealing socks from the laundry basket. Scooter's owners went to a dog trainer who told them, "You must do what wolves do. Go to him, grab the scruff of his neck, get right in his face, yell no in a loud and growly voice. You must let him know right away that you are in charge, that you're dominant, and that he can't get away with stealing things." McConnell writes, "I wish stories like Scooter's were rare, but they're not. Just as people were taught to spare the rod and spoil the child, people have been advised for years to get dominance over their dogs, and so often getting dominance meant getting aggressive." I did some research. There's actually a monastery in New York State where the monks breed German Shepherds, and they also offer dog training services. And they wrote a book called How to Be Your Dog's Best Friend, which has sold over 500,000 copies, and which at one time advised dog owners to act like wolves and do alpha rollovers, where the owners would throw dogs down on their backs to ensure that their dogs would accept them as leaders. McConnell reports that the book's main author, Job Michael Evans, later said that he deeply regretted this advice, which reminds me of Genesis book 1, verses 26 to 31. "And God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth.'" It's the old, do what I say because I told you to, and if you don't, I will hurt you. If the dog doesn't obey, it's challenging its owner's social status and must be forcibly disciplined to be kept in its place. McConnell says that some more happy-go-lucky and tough-skinned dogs will accept these dominant displays, but many other dogs become afraid of their owners because their dogs perceive they're under attack all the time. Scooter, the golden retriever, is dead now. He was euthanized at 4 months old because of his so-called dominance aggression. You may not be throwing your child to the ground to show them who's boss. Maybe you do spank them sometimes, but only when they really need it, when they really just won't listen to you. Maybe you don't spank them, but you do punish them by taking away something they love, like screen time, because they have to learn to listen. They have to learn that they can't just do what they want. But what if your child articulating their needs wasn't a challenge to your authority? McConnell tells us that if owners can remember that neither humans nor dogs need to have social status to feel loved, then they can create a more harmonious household. You may get obedience out of a dog by threatening him, but mostly you're going to get a dog who's afraid of you. Far too often you'll get a dog who learns to defend himself by getting aggressive back. You don't actually need to dominate your child either, which is what's ultimately behind the phrase, "I need my child to listen." Listen doesn't really mean listen in this context. It either means do what I say or do what I say or I'll hurt you, even if the hurting is just taking away screen time. When we're in a position to make the child listen or comply or else, we're in a position of power and dominance. Some kids will just give up when this happens and will quickly learn they can't win, and so they stop trying. And those are the children we call good because they do what they're told. But a lot more children will resist, and they may resist us and hit, bite, or kick us, or because power flows downhill, if you're seeing one child repeatedly trying to exert dominance over a younger sibling, not just sibling squabbles that are initiated by both kids, but with one kid repeatedly exerting dominance over the other, or if one child is repeatedly beating up the family dog or the cat, I'd say it's worth looking at the extent to which your child perceives that you're trying to be dominant over them. And we would have to look at this from the child's perspective. After all, Scooter's dog owners were just following trusted instructions about how to train him. But Scooter knew that this was hurtful. Conventional parenting advice might say you have to get your child to listen, but from your child's perspective, their needs are not being met. If your child's needs seem mysterious and difficult to understand, I definitely encourage you to go to yourparentingmojo.com/quiz, where you can answer 10 super short questions about your child's behavior, so I can tell you what is the need your child is probably trying to meet over and over and over again. When that need is chronically unmet, we end up with a lot of dysregulation in a lot of different situations, which makes things seem even more confusing. Fortunately, we have other ways to get our needs met, which is what we're really trying to do when we're getting our child to listen. Our best tool is to understand our needs and our child's needs and identify strategies to meet both of those needs. And sometimes we can use a little help to move things along, which is where hack number 8 comes in, which is about identifying what McConnell calls pressure points. So pressure in dog training is about the management of physical space. And in dog training, it's about how close you need to get to another animal to begin to influence its behavior. So herding dogs put pressure on sheep to get them to move, but they can't just run headlong into a flock or the sheep will panic and scatter instead of going where the shepherd wants them to go. So pressure points in sheep herding can change depending on the day, the sheep, and the weather. Essentially, the dog is managing the environment around the sheep, and we can do this with our children as well. I would always work first to understand the child's needs and look for strategies that meet both of our needs. And assuming we've done that and we're in an interaction where a little more support would be helpful, this is where managing the environment comes in. So how do we do that? Well, here are a couple of examples. So let's imagine that we're pillow fighting with our child, which they really love. And you don't mind doing it for a few minutes, but when the timer goes off to say you're done, your child does not want to stop, and it always ends up in a massive meltdown. Because it can be really difficult to transition from very fun, physical, high-energy play down to nothing, or even something boring like chores. So you can manage the environment by introducing an intermediate step, like a dance party. You'd start with loud, high-energy music, so you're still moving a lot, but you aren't hitting each other. And then you wind down the tempo of the song so your child brings down the tempo of their activity without you telling them, calm down. I've heard of parents managing background music in their homes to set a tone as well. So if you have calming music on in the background, you may find your children are more able to access a calmer state. You can also try something a bit more upbeat in the morning when you want to get moving. Another example of this pressure points is the way that I modify our environment using lights. So if we're done brushing teeth and I'm ready to transition to the bedroom and I can see that she's done, she's just not quite, moving yet, I'll turn out the light in the bathroom and turn on the light in the bedroom as I move in there. And that provides a path toward where I want to head. And then I don't have to say, come on, let's go in the bedroom. The light is giving the message for me. And when we think about all the things we ask our kids to do every day, I think anything that we can do to reduce that number is valuable. While we're on the topic of things we ask our kids to do, many of which we ask them to do multiple times, that brings us to hack number 7, which is don't repeat yourself. When people are new to dog training, apparently they repeat themselves all the time. McConnell says, in my experience, one of the most universal tendencies of all humans is to repeat ourselves when talking to dogs. She recounts a story about when she was just getting started working herding dogs with sheep. She would use lie down far too often as a crutch to help stop things while she could figure out what the heck to do next. So she would yell, lie down, lie down, lie down. In no time at all, her first border collie was trained to lie down and only to lie down, lie down, lie down. And exactly the same thing happens with our kids. We're trying to get out the door in the morning and we say, it's time to go, it's time to go, it's time to go. And our children learn that we're only really serious about leaving when we've said it 3 times and yelled the 3rd time. So they just ignore us the first 2 times. And when instead we find out why they aren't getting ready yet, we can address the issue. And you might think back to those 13 reasons why your child doesn't listen and what to do about it each one. That's on the cheat sheet you may have received when you subscribe to the podcast. If you don't have that cheat sheet, go to yourparentingmojo.com/subscribe to get it for yourself. Because this is where the term doesn't listen gets us in trouble. Because it isn't that our child isn't listening. It's possible they aren't hearing you if they're busy with play and you're calling to them. It's possible that they can't remember what tasks they need to do, in which case a task list they can check off may be helpful. But if they're resisting their tasks because their needs aren't being met, then a checklist is not going to be helpful. Think of parent Maria in my book, Parenting Beyond Power, whose daughter Isabel refused to get dressed every single morning. Didn't matter how much Maria repeated herself, Isabel would not get dressed. But when Maria finally asked, "Why don't you want to get dressed?" the answer was, "Because I like knowing that you're the last person to touch my clothes in the morning." Which, of course, Maria was willing to help Isabel get dressed, which meant Isabel stopped resisting and Maria didn't have to repeat herself anymore. Problem solved. A checklist is not going to help here because Isabel wasn't resisting because she couldn't remember the steps. But when her need for connection was met, she was happy to get dressed. You may have also noticed McConnell wasn't only repeating herself, she was repeating herself more loudly each time. It isn't uncommon for dog owners to scream, "Be quiet!" at their loudly barking dogs, just as it isn't uncommon for agitated parents to scream, "Be quiet!" at their loudly yelling children. And this is hack number 6, which is that just shouting the command louder doesn't gain compliance any more effectively than repeating it 3 times. The parallel doesn't work completely here, though. Let's imagine that our dog barks every time someone wants to come to the front door and we want them to stop doing it. The dog training tool to use is that when they start barking, the owner says enough and creates a distraction to get the dog to stop barking and then gives the dog a treat. Over time, you lengthen the pause between the enough and the treat until you can just say enough and the dog stops barking and comes to you for their treat. We're not going to treat children for being quiet. And the most important part of this idea is that screaming at them to be quiet probably isn't going to get the job done. If we're struggling with the noise volume, then we have a number of tools we can try. Perhaps the first of which is talking quietly, which means your child has to reduce their own volume to hear you. You could ask if your child is willing to turn down their volume a little bit or move to another room, or you could offer to move to another room. I first shared that idea a long time ago when we started learning about how ideas from nonviolent communication apply to our parenting. And more than one parent has told me they were shocked when they first heard that because it was the first time they'd considered that they might be able to do something that could help them meet their needs rather than only getting their child to change their behavior. My daughter usually wants my presence in the room, so when I offer to move to another room, which I am perfectly willing to do, she will usually, not always, but usually find a way to turn the volume down on whatever she's doing. It's entirely her choice, and she'd rather have me close by than continue with her loud activity. Hack number 5 is to not always expect immediate compliance from your dog or from your child. This is an easier one to see in ourselves than in our children. So if your spouse calls you to come and help them with something, do you ever respond, "Just a minute"? If your child asks for your help, do you ever respond, "I'll be there in a second"? And does that second or minute almost invariably turn into several minutes as you finish what you were doing, maybe go to the bathroom, check your phone, and then see what they wanted? We can almost see ourselves using the delay as a way of asserting our need for autonomy. We're saying, "Yeah, I'll come when I'm ready." Even the countdown that parents give as a way to try to ease into transitions can feel irritating when you're on the receiving end. I cook dinner most nights, but on the nights when my husband makes dinner, he likes us to arrive at the moment it's served so we can appreciate how great everything looks and eat it while it's hot. Karis doesn't give a hoot whether her dinner is hot or not, so she's never in a hurry to come. But pretty often, he's in the kitchen shouting to Karis over the metallic clanging of the spatula against the wok and the very loud extractor fan. He's saying, "Can you tell Mama dinner will be ready in 10 minutes? Can you tell Mama dinner will be ready in 5 minutes? Can you tell Mama dinner's ready?" Of course, I have superhuman hearing, so I hear him yelling at her, and then she comes to tell me, and I already know anyway, roughly when dinner's going to be, because he has such a limited repertoire of meals that I know where he is in the preparation cycle of each one by the sounds coming from the kitchen. Each reminder is a distraction from whatever I'm trying to finish before I break away, and I find it kind of irritating. It's the kind of thing you don't realize is irritating until you're on the other side of it, because of course parents do it with the best of intentions to reduce the surprise of the transition. If your child isn't complying with your request, you might first consider, is the request necessary? Is there a way you could modify the environment instead? If the child finds the request really difficult, could you make a different request? Recently, Karis was getting her lunch ready in the mornings when she had her not school program. She would disappear into a room and hide under the blankets when we asked her to get her food ready. She's 10 and a half. She's technically old enough to be able to get her lunch ready. But it turned out that when she was under a time crunch, she found it really stressful. She had to remember all the things that she might want to have for lunch and then figure out which of those we actually had. and it was just too much for her. We could have considered having her get her lunch ready the night before, but things like apples go brown overnight. My needs, in this case, were for ease in the mornings. I didn't want to find out 10 minutes before I was due to get on a call that she didn't want to make her lunch. I also had needs for competence in parenting and for collaboration, meaning the knowledge that I'm not raising a child who can't or won't do anything for herself and who's willing to work with me. The strategy we settled on was that she would unload the dishwasher and I would make her lunch. That met my need for ease, because I could make her lunch when I'm ready, as well as my need for competence in parenting and for collaboration. And it met her needs for ease and mental space, because unloading the dishwasher doesn't require much thinking at a time when she doesn't have as much mental capacity. And if the request is necessary, perhaps we could ask our child what ideas they have for how we can meet their needs in that moment. If neither of you have any ideas, you can go back to hack number 8 and modify the environment. So if your child is resisting leaving the playground after school, you might try offering to walk out with a good friend of theirs. The walk to the car or the bus stop seems a lot more fun when one of their friends is coming along too, rather than having to leave a fun place for something that isn't fun at all. Maybe you could evenly set up a daily routine of doing this, and then you, and possibly the other parent as well, don't have a problem anymore. Hack number 4 is a tricky one, and it's one that's taken me a long time to learn, which is getting more comfortable with other people's dysregulation. McConnell says it's natural for us primates to want to calm an animal by putting a hand on it, and not always just for the receiver's sake. Merely seeing others in a state of upset is in itself upsetting for many of us. Jane Goodall made the case that in times of agitation, the chimps she observed weren't only being altruistic when trying to calm others down. They were trying to calm things down for their own sake. But touch doesn't always calm the ones who receive it, not if they're pumped up and agitated. I've seen several owners who were bitten by their dog after they tried petting the dog to calm him down when he was agitated or aroused. Humans can turn on those we love when we're emotionally charged up and frustrated, pushing well-meaning friends away, and sometimes not very gently. That kind of redirected aggression is common in many species, from birds to rodents, and there's no reason it should be surprising in dogs. So the lesson here is that if we engage an animal that's dysregulated, we may get bitten. Maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, with harsh words. If we try to get them to calm down, it may well backfire. Have you ever been angry about something you thought was totally legitimate and that you should have a right to be angry about, and had someone tell you to calm down? And I'm wondering, did that help you feel calmer? I don't think those words have actually ever helped anyone to feel calmer. And let's be honest here, we aren't really saying calm down or patting the dog or telling a child to shh for their own benefit. We're doing it for our benefit because we are so uncomfortable with their dysregulation. Think back to that time when you were told to calm down and it didn't help you to calm down. Is it possible that not only did it not help you to calm down, but that it actually made you feel more angry? Did you perhaps feel angry about the original thing that you felt angry about, and now, in addition, also feel angry that the person telling you to calm down so clearly did not understand what was a big deal this thing was to you? How you were so clearly the aggrieved party and that they should be on your side? What did you want the person to do in that situation? I'd hypothesize that you wanted them to say, yeah, that does suck. You're right. I can see why this is so important to you. In other words, we wanted them to empathize with us, to be on our side, to show us that they understand us. And because our kids are people too, that's what they want when they're having a hard time. They want our empathy. They want to know we're on their side. They want to know we understand them. When they're having a meltdown and we tell them to calm down, it's possible that this makes the meltdown longer, because it's no longer just about the original mishap. It's now also about how they think we don't understand them. I once coached a parent of a preschooler who would go into a full-on hitting, kicking, biting meltdown every afternoon when it was time to finish the one-on-one playtime he'd had with mom up to that point, and then transition into getting ready to pick up an older sibling from school. Mom had been explaining with a good deal of exasperation, why is this so hard? It's time to go pick up your brother. We do this every day. And I said, why don't we give something else a try? Next time you see that you're heading for a meltdown, try saying, I hear you. It's really hard to end our special time and get ready to pick up your brother when you know you're going to have to share me with him for the rest of the evening. And she did that, and the meltdown just stopped. And I will say that empathizing for the purpose of getting the child to stop the meltdown may well backfire. Children can see through that stuff just like adults can. But if you truly empathize with them, and if their need for understanding and being heard is met, then it will likely help. And to do that, you have to be comfortable with a bit of crying. I find it's especially hard for parents socialized as female who are taught to take care of everyone else in the room before themselves, because crying from a child must mean they have failed in that job. If this is intolerable when we were also taught that we have to do things perfectly to win our parents' affection and love and approval. Crying is a highly auditorily irritating signal that we interpret as saying you're doing something wrong. But this is a misinterpretation. This isn't actually the message our child is sending. They're actually trying to say something like, I'm having a hard time. I have a need that isn't being met and it doesn't feel good, and crying helps me to tell you that. I need help. When it's too uncomfortable for us to hear the crying, we shut it down, perhaps by trying to convince the child the situation isn't that bad and they were okay, or by distracting them. And then we also miss the opportunity to learn what need the child is trying to express, which is the reason they were crying in the first place. If we can learn to get a little more comfortable with the crying, then we can help the child to meet their need. And if we can reframe our need for competence in parenting from being a parent who can get their child to stop crying quickly to being a parent who can hold space for difficult feelings so the child learns that all feelings are okay to express, then we can also meet our own need for competence. When we can be more comfortable with dysregulation, we're also better able to co-regulate, which is hack number 3. Dr. McConnell says that our vocalizations reflect our own internal state, but they also affect the individual hearing them. She had a friend, Todd, who she said was inappropriately mounted on an untrained, excitable horse. Todd desperately repeated, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," as his horse accelerated into a panicked gallop. The faster the horse went, the faster "whoa" came out of Todd's mouth, both of them locked in an escalating spiral that's easy to get into and hard to get out of. Agitated humans make sounds that reflect how they're feeling inside. Instead of helping the animal do what is wanted or stop doing something, those sounds often agitate the animal that hears them. Dr. McConnell spent 5 years researching the sounds animal handlers make, and across 104 handlers speaking 16 different languages, she found a universal use of short, rapidly repeated notes to get animals to speed up, and single, continuous notes to slow or stop them. So when we're with a child who's distressed, if we're making short, sharp sounds like, okay, 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 or you're okay, you're okay, you're okay, we may actually be creating more distress in the child when we're trying to reduce it. I could imagine holding a regulated infant or toddler and saying shh, which would fulfill the requirement of a slow sound. But because it also carries the connotation of keep quiet, I'm not sure I'd actually use that. For a child that young who's in full physical contact with you, holding them, you might just try a simple humming, For an older child who's maybe near you but not in full physical contact, I actually can't think of a long, slow sound that you could make that wouldn't sound completely weird. But I have seen that stroking the child's arm or leg or back with long, slow strokes can be very calming. And in fact, when Karis is having an especially hard time and she's been at it for a while, she's able to communicate to me that she's ready to stop crying, but she doesn't know how. And at that point, actually a full-on massage can be helpful. So we put a towel down on the sofa, use moisturizer so it doesn't make a huge mess. It doesn't work at the beginning of a meltdown because she isn't ready to accept it yet. But when it's been going on for a while and I see that she wishes she could stop, but she can't, it then helps her to focus on something other than her dysregulation. And of course, it relies on me being able to regulate myself and not perceive that I'm incompetent because I have a 10-year-old who sometimes has meltdowns, and see that she needs my help. And when I respond to her in this way, it helps to bring us closer because she trusts me to help her. Hack number 2 is about ways to support skill building in stressful situations. Dr. McConnell describes how her Great Pyrenees dog, Tulip, once came tearing out of the barn pursuing a fox. It's Tulip's job to keep the sheep safe from foxes and coyotes. Dr. McConnell knew there was a hole in the fence and didn't want Tulip leaving the farm, so she yelled, "No!" And Tulip stopped. And Dr. McConnell called, "Come!" And Tulip came running. And this is quite a feat. Dogs like border collies are trained to herd sheep and will do exactly what you tell them if they're trained to do it. Although when I was growing up, we actually had a border collie that was none too smart and was afraid of sheep. But a Great Pyrenees is so independent, they are quite happy to live outdoors with the sheep all the time. You can ask a Great Pyrenees to do something, but you can't assume they're going to do it. So to have a Great Pyrenees stop on a dime when they're in full sprint in pursuit of an animal they're trained to chase is pretty impressive. And Dr. McConnell did this by playing Come with Tulip about 5 times a day when she was an adolescent, calling in a happy and clear voice and then turning and moving away from Tulip, which the dog perceives as a chase game, which is a reward. And then throwing a ball or a treat seals the deal. Tressa Fessend and Mackenzie at the Sonoma County SPCA thinks a lot about how to apply dog training approaches to her relationship with her own kids, and she suggests using this kind of training for stressful situations with the full knowledge and consent of the child. As we return once again to the topic of consent, we have to remember that Tressa works with dogs. And as we saw in episode 215 on Why Will No One Play With Me, the behavioral therapists don't always get this full consent from the children that they work with. An example of a stressful situation might be introducing some new nail clippers that the child hasn't seen before, and they're feeling worried about using them. So we could use the clippers on ourselves first, and then maybe play manicures and make a show of treating the child in a special way as we use them. I've seen a video on Tressa's Instagram page describing how her son needed prescription eye drops, so she let him put some non-prescription drops in her eyes first so that he would feel more comfortable with them, presumably also meeting his need for autonomy. She also suggests that we could support children in navigating stressful social situations by practicing these skills in advance, just like we learned in the Why Will No One Play With Me episode. When the child can practice what to say when another child is trying to take a toy from them, or what to say if the child doesn't like how another person's interacting with them at home with you, perhaps multiple times, they're going to be much more likely to be able to use muscle memory and be able to use that skill again when the stressful situation arises out in the real world. But of course, we want to do this with the child's full knowledge and consent. I wanted to save the best for last, and hack number 1 is super important. It's the idea that really caught my ear right after the consent issue, and this is that difficult behavior from dogs never comes out of nowhere. When they feel afraid, they may try to communicate this to us using signals like putting their ears back, licking their lips, opening their eyes really wide so that you can see the whites, putting their weight back, lifting their paws, keeping their mouth closed, or a sort of grin or a smile that you might have seen dogs doing in social media videos because it looks like they're laughing, but actually it indicates that they're afraid. So they'll almost certainly give us one of those signals first. And if we keep coming towards the dog may then bite us. If we don't know how to read the dog's signals, which I didn't know how to do until I went through the training, and we're with a dog showing those signals and we keep moving toward them, is it any wonder that we end up getting bitten? Dr. McConnell tells a great story about this in The Other End of the Leash. She does a demonstration in her seminars where she praises her border collie Pip for giving her a ball back. Dr. McConnell says, Pip loves balls like life itself. To reward her for giving me the ball back, I coo her and lavishly stroke her head. People watching respond to my efforts to praise Pip and seem to feel really good when I'm done. They feel so good they give me an A+ when I ask them to grade my efforts to make Pip feel glad that she gave me the ball. But I give myself a D because although the audience enjoyed hearing my praise and seeing me pet her, Pip just wanted the ball. I repeat the exercise, this time telling the audience to pay careful attention to Pip's face. Her reaction is obvious once you focus your attention on her. She ignores my sweet words, squints her eyes, ducks her head away from my hand, presses forward, staring like a laser at the ball. As soon as the audience has learned to focus on Pip's reactions rather than their own, they get it. Pip's avoidance of my hand and obvious impatience to get the ball back aren't subtle at all. But for some reason, we humans tend not to pay attention to the visual signals that our dogs send us. Hundreds of clients who come to my office for help with their dogs have described their pet's aggression as having appeared, quote, out of the blue. Yet I could plainly see, even as the owners were talking to me, that the dog was clearly communicating, stop petting me like that. I'm going to bite you if you don't stop. To the owners who haven't been trained to understand dog signals, the dog's bad behavior appears out of the blue. But to the person who knows how to recognize it, the dog's communication is obvious. And you don't need a ton of training to recognize it. Karis and I learned a lot by watching a 15-minute video of dogs we'd never seen before. Dr. McConnell's audience learned Pip's signals in just a few minutes. Your child's difficult behavior doesn't come out of nowhere either. Your child has signals too, and you can learn how to see them. So let's imagine that we're in a situation where our child is hitting us on a pretty regular basis. One day they get home from school and we ask them how their day is. They don't answer. We ask again. They turn their body away from us, still not answering. We ask a third time, and the child hits us. When a parent comes to a coaching session with me and discusses this kind of problem, they'll typically tell me their child just hit them out of nowhere. And if we aren't taught or haven't learned to recognize the signals that a hit is about to come, we can see why it seemed to come out of nowhere. We might even think to ourselves, well, a responsible, involved parent asks their child about their day. How else am I going to understand what's going on in their world and make conversation over dinner? Besides, it doesn't seem that hard to answer a simple question. It's a basic courtesy when an adult asks his child a question. I must be doing something wrong if my child won't answer. I'm going to ask again because this is really important. And my heart just goes out to parents who are trying their absolute hardest to do what we're supposed to do, to be a good parent, to be involved in our child's life, to know what's going on with them so that we can be connected to them. But here's the thing, that kind of blanket advice that good parents do this misses the mark because it doesn't take into account what this child needs. And what this child communicated when they didn't answer was probably some combination of, I've had a long day, I'm tired, I'm feeling really overwhelmed from having to do what I'm told all day long. Thinking about how to answer your question is going to take more mental capacity than I have right now, so I'm not going to answer. And then when we ask again, our child turning away from us, maybe communicating something like, didn't you hear me last time? I really can't talk about this right now. I don't have the capacity to be able to answer you, and so I'm going to turn away from you and hope that you don't ask me again. Maybe I'll be able to talk about it later, but I'm not sure. And then we ask again, and they've already tried so hard to tell us that they didn't want to talk about it at that moment, and we haven't received their message twice, and they just don't know how else to get the message across, and they hit us. From our perspective, it might seem like the hit came out of nowhere, but it didn't really. And just as we can learn to see a dog putting their ears back, licking their lips, knowing that they feel afraid and might bite us if we keep coming toward them, we can learn to see our child's behavior that means, I can't deal with this right now, and we can back off. And this hack brings us full circle back to those consent checks from hack number 1. Did that idea sound at all familiar to you? I'm thinking back to episode 201 on how to create a culture of consent in our families, when I shared how my understanding of consent has shifted. We typically think of consent related to sexual relationships, and I used to perceive it as something that was granted one time in an interaction. If a person says or indicates yes, then they've consented to whatever's going to happen in that interaction. And now I think of consent as something that's an ongoing negotiation in any interaction. In a sexual encounter, we're both verbally and non-verbally asking, is this okay? Is this okay? Is it still okay? I argued in the consent episode that we can't expect to override our child's consent throughout their childhood and then expect them to know how to manage consent in the romantic and sexual relationships they have when they're older. When they get into those romantic and sexual relationships, they're going to practice whatever they've learned from us throughout our lives together up to that point. If they've learned from us that consent is important and they can withdraw their consent to be in an interaction at any time, then they will carry that knowledge into their later relationships as well. They will know that if something doesn't feel right to them, they can say that and end the encounter. And this doesn't just apply to sex. I can't tell you how many difficult conversations I've had with my husband over the last decade or so, where he's just talked at me for a very long time, and I sat there in silence, not knowing how to end the interaction or even that I could. Now I know that I can end it if I want to, and I know how to do it. But it took me a decade to figure that out. Because when I was a kid, my dad would lecture me for hours about my perceived failings, and I didn't have the right to end that conversation. I just had to stand there while he talked and talked. I don't even remember about what anymore, because I coped with it by tuning him out, by not listening, just trying to nod and say at the right points. So it's not super surprising that when my husband would do exactly the same thing, that I would respond in exactly the same way. Now that my husband and I have the skills to talk about it, he's told me he would talk at me in an attempt to draw me out, despite the fact that it never had the intended effect and I would just sit there in silence. He was trying to get me to talk by talking at me. I registered my non-consent with my dad by shutting down, because if I'd answered back or walked away, the consequences would have been worse. So as a full-grown adult, you would think I would have more tools at my disposal, but no. I defaulted right back to the same tools I learned as a child. I never said no, but my body language was saying no over and over again for long stretches of time. But my husband didn't know how to read it. Can you remember similar interactions with your parents or caregivers? Were there times when they overrode your ideas about what felt right to you because they believed something different? Maybe they wouldn't let you make decisions about your hairstyle or the clothes that you wore. Did they want you to keep doing a sport that you didn't like or try a new one when you had one you already liked? Did they force you to take swimming lessons even though you hated it? Did you know that in your heart of hearts that what they were telling you to do was not right for you? And did you go along with it anyway? Did you try to communicate your non-consent verbally or non-verbally? Did you try refusing to go to whatever the thing was or doing badly at it? Or did you double down on the hairstyle or the clothes in a non-verbal dare to them to try to stop you? They either didn't know how to read your non-consent or they saw it and overrode it because they thought it was in your best interest. Maybe you can look back now and see that they did have your best interests at heart, but it wasn't or wouldn't have been the end of the world to do things your way. It's your life. We all want to make decisions about things we think are important to us, our children included. That's why it's so important to create a culture of consent in our families today. And we can start doing that, checking whether our child is consenting to being in interactions with us, reading their verbal and nonverbal cues to understand this. If we're asking them to do something and they aren't answering and we're reasonably sure they heard us, or they're not making eye contact anymore, or they're turning away, or even more than that, we can read that as withdrawing consent. Doesn't mean we can't ever ask how their day was. We can even talk with them, maybe on the weekend, and say something like, I'd love to know how you're doing at school. I'm wondering if sometimes you feel overwhelmed when you get home. I've noticed that sometimes you turn away from me when I ask about it then. Is there a good way that I can ask you about that? Or a time of day that works better for you? Or is there another way I can find out how you're doing? Of course, we aren't doing this as a rapid fire Q&A, but a conversation where we're checking for consent to be in this conversation and working to find a way that we can get consent for future conversations as well. It may sound like a lot, but it's not actually that hard. It just means being on the lookout for resistance from your child that might indicate that they aren't consenting to something and pausing in that moment instead of just keeping going, which might be what we've been doing up to this point. When we pause, we can look at what about this situation is not working for the child and make that right. Okay, so to sum up, here are those 10 hacks one more time. Hack number 10 is creating a culture of consent by making sure our child has a say over decisions that feel important to them. Number 9 is not dominating our children because we don't have to dominate them to have our needs met. Hack number 8 is the judicious identification and use of pressure points. We don't want to be doing that all the time, but where we've struggled to identify our child's needs or we can't find a way to meet them without feeling resent for ourselves, modifying the environment can help move us forward. Number 7 is don't repeat yourself, or you just train your child to not do what you ask until you repeat yourself. And this is linked to number 6, which is to not shout at your child to do things, or you train them to not do what you ask until you shout. Hack number 5 is to not expect immediate compliance from your child, just like you don't always give immediate compliance when someone asks you to do something. Hack number 4 is about getting comfortable with your child's dysregulation, which enables hack number 3, co-regulating with your child. It's really hard to support your child in navigating their dysregulation when their dysregulation makes you dysregulated. Hack number 2 shows us how to support skill building by practicing in low stress situations before you do the same tasks in higher stress situations. And finally, hack number 1 brings us full circle by showing us how to use our child's nonverbal communication to understand what's happening with them. So difficult behavior no longer seems like it's appearing out of nowhere because we've seen it coming, we've responded to it early, and then our child doesn't get to the point of huge dysregulation as often. This was a really fun episode for me to put together, so I hope you enjoyed it as well. If your child's behavior still seems unpredictable and really difficult to understand, please do check out the Tell Me What My Child Needs quiz at yourparentingmojo.com/quiz. Super short, just 10 questions. We will send you a report at the end that highlights your child's most important need, the one they're trying to meet over and over again, and a whole bunch of strategies that you can use to help them meet that need. That's at yourparentingmojo.com/quiz.